I'm reminded, hearing the Honourable Jing Li's speech about St Francis of Assisi, reminded of one of his quotes, that is, to err is human, but to persist in error is devilish. And, Mr President, it is very disappointing to see that the two major parties in this place have not changed their ways, that they haven't reflected on the public backlash, the outrage that we saw in not only the public gallery, the community that came and actually watched the debate here in this chamber, but also that we saw on the steps of Parliament, because people were rightly outraged at what they saw. It is an affront on our democracy. It's really disappointing to see this affront on our democracy being led by a Labor government, a party that was actually founded on protest. The strikes of workers, the action of workers to demand fair pay. It's a real affront to those fundamental principles that underpin the Labor Party, that they take their marching orders not from the union movement on this issue, but from David Speers and the Liberals. The Honourable David Speers and the Liberals, who really just listened to shock jocks and crafted a highly reactionary policy on the run. And what the government should have done is actually subjected that to some level of scrutiny, taken a cold shower, but instead they rushed it through the Parliament in the other place at record speed. 20 minutes, less time than it takes to do a load of washing. It was outrageous, absolutely outrageous, and a slap in the face to all South Australians that care about our democracy. Luckily, in this chamber, it was subject to scrutiny, and I want to acknowledge the leadership of my colleagues, the Honourable Tammy Franks, and also the Honourable Connie Benares and the Honourable Frank Pangello, who fought really hard alongside the Greens to try and resist this affront on our democracy, and who have stayed true to the principles that they advocated for on that night, and are standing with us in supporting this repeal bill tonight. I don't propose to revisit the lengthy speech that I gave 12 months ago, nearly 12 months to the day. You'll be relieved to know, Mr President, I traversed in that speech the origins of our democracy going back from ancient Greece. What I will do, though, just make some brief remarks about some of the changes we have seen since we last discussed this matter. Since this bill has passed, a declaration of our right to protest has been signed by 60 organisations. And I will just read a few elements from that, Mr President, in the hope that it might convince some of my colleagues to change their position on this bill.
Conclusion of the debate. This isn't a second reading speech.
No, but it is relevant, Mr President, in terms of some of the comments that have been made, I think, for people to understand the changes that have happened. So 60 organisations have signed on to a declaration that begins, "The right to peaceful protest is a fundamental human right that allows us to express our views, shape our societies and press for social and legal change." And it states, "All Australian governments have an obligation to guarantee the right to protest and protect protesters. However, state governments around the country have passed harsh, repressive and undemocratic anti-protest laws. This declaration, grounded in human rights law, asserts the fundamental right to protest and offers practical steps to safeguard the right from further erosion." And this has been signed by a range of organisations, Mr President: Amnesty International, Australian Democracy Network, Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, Australian Services Union, Human Rights Law Centre, the Rights Resource Network of South Australia and SACOS. These are leaders in their field, and they have come out in advocating for the right to protest to be protected in our democracy. I will also just note, responding to the comments of the Honourable Emily Burke, in many jurisdictions we have seen similar laws to the ones we passed here in South Australia have a chilling effect and produce some really adverse outcomes. Indeed, in New South Wales in 2022, where they saw legislation passed, there was a maximum penalty of $22,000 condemned by the Council of Civil Liberties. But we saw at that time Violet Coco sentenced for 2 years in prison for blocking a lane of traffic. Danny Lim was peacefully protesting with a sign, was assaulted by New South Wales police. When they slammed him to the ground face first, he ended up in hospital. Cherish Kunan was arrested at her home in the middle of the night, 12 hours after she engaged in lawful assembly. Members of the community who camped on private property on Colo, New South Wales, were arrested accused of planning protests. In Tasmania, we've seen their laws subject to a High Court challenge. And in Queensland, they have recently passed legislation that deals with locking on. Indeed, members might reflect that that was the practice that Muriel Matters engaged in when she changed herself to the Great in the Women's Gallery in Westminster. And yet, this is precisely the kind of action that members in this place have sought to quell. Might I say, it is a really sad thing in our democracy, Mr. President, when we have the people who are belling the cat on the climate emergency speaking out against the climate crisis. They're being subject to fines and the threat of jail, while we have the fossil fuel industry getting huge subsidies in the federal budget over in Canberra and getting huge handouts from the state government here in South Australia, slaps on the back, rather than them being held to account for the impact that they have on driving the climate crisis. It's disgraceful. I urge members of this place to revisit their position, to think again, to turn away from their phones, turn their minds away from their devices, and instead turn their minds to the people they represent and ask themselves what they think, what people in the union movement think, what people in the civil rights organisations think about this attack on our democracy. And with that, I conclude my remarks, and I will be bringing it to this matter to a vote, Mr. President, so that all members of the community can see the views of their elected members.